What is going on, everyone? So in this video, I'm going to continue the theme as far as sharing a handful of photos that all have something in common. And this week, it is something that was suggested by a viewer. And basically, I did a video a couple weeks back where I talked about rear tilt. And this time, I'm going to talk about front tilt. Now, it was almost kind of difficult to go through all the photos I have to try to find ones that are a good example of front tilt, mostly because almost every single photo I shoot uses some degree of front tilt. Front tilt gives you the ability to take your plane of focus, which is normally parallel with your film plane, and to adjust it at different angles. And this is especially important for shooting landscapes because you usually have some degree of foreground, some degree of midground, some degree of background. And if you can take your plane of focus and have it sort of connect all three of those, you're going to end up having a pretty sharp photo without having to go to a really insane aperture. The other thing too is on these cameras, depth of field is insanely shallow. So it's not that you can do this. You kind of have to do this if you want to be able to try to get a good chunk of the subjects in a scene in focus. Now there are some times when front tilt doesn't work. That is if you have some really strong verticals within the composition that go from basically the bottom to the top. So it could be in a forest with trees. It could be in a really narrow canyon like the Narrows in Zion. If you use front tilt in those situations, you're going to notice that you might have part of those verticals, like the bottom of the tree might be in focus, but then it gets really soft and blurry as you go up, and that doesn't really look all that good. So those are the times when you really can't use it. But basically what happens is, let's say that, we'll say this right here is your plane of focus, which is going to be parallel to the film plane in the back. And as you adjust the front tilt, what's going to happen is that the plane of focus is going to drop down. And it does not take very much movement right there in order to have a pretty profound difference in the final photo, and you'll very easily see it when you set up the photo. So let's start with a really easy example of an ideal situation for using front tilt. So this is a photo I shot back in, I think it was 2015. I was in the Salt Flats in Death Valley. I had all these really cool foreground dots of these kind of pools of salt that dry up. And I sort of wandered around until I found an area that I kind of was able to make sense of the madness of the foreground. And I used my wide angle lens and I used a little bit of front tilt so that I can take that plane of focus and I can kind of drop it down. So that way the foreground is in focus, the midground is in focus, the background is in focus. And I basically connected the plane of focus from the salt in the foreground out to the top of those mountains back in the background. There's no clouds in the sky. I didn't have to worry about anything along those lines. Really, really super easy to do. I still shot it at about f/45 because what happens is that as you bring that plane of focus down at an angle and then you stop the aperture down, it's going to open into a wedge. So you have a much better chance of catching sort of the midground in focus as well. Because technically the plane of focus will usually skim from the top of those mountains to the foreground and kind of miss the midground a little bit. But when you stop down, it opens into a wedge and kind of gets all the most important areas. So this was a really easy use of front tilt, especially on a wide angle lens, just because they have a bit of a larger depth of field to begin with. So the next example I'm going to show is one taken in Zion. This was, I believe, the same year, 2015. And it had snowed the day before, and so as that snow melted, it really changed the color of the ground cover. And I was at the base of this really big ponderosa pine tree, and all the needles and all of the pine cones are all really dark in color, which is really nice because they absorbed all that moisture from the day before. And I really liked the way that there's this low-growing maple that was in transition in color from green to yellow. And it was just kind of growing really nicely along the ground. And this is an area that I had seen many times before, I'd returned to many times before, but just was so that on this particular day, on this particular trip, I returned to that location and saw that it was really, really good to photograph because of the deepened color. I took the photo in the morning when it was all in indirect light. And when I was setting up the photo, I had the camera kind of angled down towards the ground. And it would be really hard to get this whole scene in focus by simply using a more stop-down aperture, just because the depth of field is so really shallow. So I did a little bit of front tilt. I connected the plane of focus from the foreground pine needles kind of along and kind of skimmed along that maple branch, kind of in the middle ground towards the background. And this really gave me a plane of focus that was really ideal for the subject. Now when I stopped down to f/45 and opened that into a wedge, it never really captures the area back in the distance, back behind that maple. You never really get that in focus, but in this case, that is perfectly fine because I think if anything, it helps to simplify the photo a little bit because you have all the most important parts of this composition in focus. And there's many scenes where you can never actually get everything in focus, but in this scene, I got the most important stuff and had a really calm moment there without any wind and was able to do an exposure to kind of capture everything in those really ideal conditions. Now that photo is taken with my 300mm normal lens. I really like the way that that one turned out. And the final example I'm going to show is a little bit more tricky. And when I was first getting into large format, there were some photos I shot where I used a little too much front tilt and kind of got me into trouble because you could very well have a situation where basically you get some parts of the photos near the top that are not in focus that you really want to be in focus. And this is a situation where I was really careful with how I set up. I used my 150mm wide angle lens for this photo, and I set up a composition along these really beautiful falls near the subway area. And basically I was able to set up so the foreground had this kind of cascade, and that cascade leads up towards the background. In the background, there's this really beautiful glow that happens in the morning. And there's this full-size ponderosa pine tree. And for me, that pine tree is one of the really important elements in this photo because as you look at the photo, your eye kind of wanders up that cascade into the background, drawn to that warmth of that tree and that reflected light in the background. So I knew it was important to show the entirety of the tree. I didn't want to chop off the top, but also it's really important to have it in focus. So if I were to simply take my plane of focus and do the front tilt to have the plane of focus kind of follow along the course of that cascade, what'll happen is I'm not even going to be able to get that tree in focus completely in the background. So if I take my plane of focus, if I drop it down, if I'm not careful, there's areas as that opens into a wedge as you stop down. If you are above that area right there, it's going to be soft. There's no way you could possibly stop that lens down far enough to get that area, that's significantly above that plane of focus into focus. So when I tilted it, I made sure that I was able to get the foreground cascade kind of out to the very top of that tree. And then as you stop down, the plane of focus moves upward just a tiny bit, but mostly drops down. And I was able to capture pretty much everything. And it can be a little tricky because there's a lot of important parts in a scene like this as far as the foreground, the midground, the background. But since I was using a wide angle lens, it was very forgiving. So I was able to get a photo that had all the most important parts, but just be very careful about how much you tilt that lens. Just be advised that anything above your plane of focus, you're not guaranteed to have any of that in focus. And this also comes into play if you were to have a photo that has kind of like the first one of the salt flats, but if there's some clouds up in the sky, if you simply connect your plane of focus up to those mountains, those clouds might be a little out of focus, which in all honesty is not a big deal. But if they're really out of focus, it might look a little bit on the weird side. So I hope you guys enjoyed the examples, and we'll see you around next week.